All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Those of you who are grabbing your coffee and your donut, come on in. I promise you will not go hungry today. I promise. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Race and Slavery in New England Symposium. First of all, before we get started, I've been asked to remind you that we all must wear masks when we're indoors today, unless obviously you are having a sip of your coffee. The speakers are allowed by Mass state law to unmask during their speech, hence my full face. I'm Bethany Groff-Dureau. I'm the executive director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and it has been my great pleasure to come into this project at the 11th hour and claim all the credit. I'm just kidding. I have no credit to claim for this. This project has been ongoing for years, and there has been an incredible steering committee who has seen this to fruition. As we gear up for our jam-packed day, I'd like to thank our sponsors and partners, the H. Patterson Hale Jr. Charitable Foundation, Eastern Bank, Newburyport Bank, the First Religious Society of Newburyport, and my alma mater, Historic New England. On this day and every day, I would also like to express our gratitude to the people who came before us. The land on which we are gathering today was the traditional farming and fishing ground of the Pawtucket, a band of families who also had kinship ties to the Pennacook. In addition, enslaved people and indentured servants worked this land alongside laborers from around the world for centuries. We also extend special thanks to the Governor's Academy, who generously donated not only this amazing meeting space, but all refreshments and lunch and some amazing tech resources and personnel for this event. And without the tireless efforts of Bill Quigley, who's probably still in the lobby, greeting people. Bill, where are you? Bill. Who is the chair of the steering committee for this event, a member of my museum board, and an educator here at the Governor's Academy. This would not have been possible. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, one of two presenters today who is coming to us on Zoom through the magic of technology. While John is coming up, I'll remind you to please mute your phones and also apologize in advance for any technical glitches, but here he is. John Demos, a historian and writer, is the Samuel Knight Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University, where he taught from 1986 to 2011. His books include Entertaining Satan, Witchcraft and Culture of Early New England, The Unredeemed Captive, A Family Story from Early America, and The Heathen School, A Story of Hope and Betrayal in the Age of the Early Republic. He was twice a finalist for the National Book Award and winner of the Bancroft and Parkman Prizes. His current book project is tentatively titled The Silver Mountain, Colonel Potosi and the Coming of the Modern World. Welcome, John.
Good morning, and greetings from 100 miles away. I would much prefer to be with you in the room. COVID has nixed that possibility, but thanks to Zoom, we go on anyway. I trust, by the way, you won't mind my wearing my Red Sox cap. If there are any other Red Sox fans in the room or on Zoom, you'll know that last night was a fantastic game, and I considered actually wearing the cap to bed, but then thought better of it. Anyway, some of you on the program I know personally and not others, but I feel confident in predicting from the look of things that we're going to have a very interesting day. And before I go any further, I want to thank the Newbury Historical Society, Bethany Durrell, Susan Edwards, Colleen, Bill, and other members of the organizing team for taking charge so effectively. We're all in their debt for bringing our group together. My role today is to introduce the proceedings and later on to conclude them. You might be wondering what qualifications I have for this task. not many, at least not much direct involvement in the topic of the day. Although I can't help remembering just now that my very first course in graduate school was a seminar whose title was The History of Slavery and Anti-Slavery, taught by Professor Kenneth Stamp, author of what was then the leading book on the subject, entitled The Peculiar Institution. And the paper I wrote for Professor Stamp's seminar on the rise of Garrisonian abolitionism became my very first publication. Nobody in the audience or on the panel would know about it. It's long since gone with the winds of time, I guess, but I can still vividly remember my excitement on reading the letter of acceptance from the editor of the New England Quarterly. Wow, something I wrote is going to be published. And I'm sure others on the panel have had similar experiences. All that was in 1960, 61, 62, fully 6 decades ago. And since then, I've been not a contributor, but a very interested spectator, and you might say a consumer of a lot of extraordinary scholarship around slavery, anti-slavery, and race. Arguably, no other subfield in the whole of US history has had quite such a run as this one. Most others go in and out of fashion, are hot for a time, hit a peak, and then kind of subside until the next round. But not the history of slavery and its coordinates. Time and again, it sort of renews and reinvigorates itself. It grabs us over and over and won't let go. And for very good reasons, which seem so obvious that they hardly need to be described. A roster of absolutely front-rank scholars has carried the freight during my 60-odd years of spectatorship. Kenneth Stamp, whom I mentioned a minute ago, my former colleague and friend, David Bryan Davis. David devoted an entire career to it and made perhaps the single widest impact. George Frederickson, Eugene Genovese, Herbert Gutman, Robert Fogel, Stanley Engerman, John Blassingame, Ira Berlin, and others whose names don't occur to me right now, all of them giants of yore, and it does feel important to at least tick off their names. Their work taken together covers the period from about 1950 to 1990, although Davis went on until just a few years ago. And I'm not even going to try for the names of more recent contributors. They are legion, and they are changing the face of slavery scholarship practically by the hour. And some of them are here with us today. Parenthetically, and in order to forestall embarrassment, I want to admit that I've not kept up with many of the most recent contributions, including some or most of those of our panelists. So what I'm about to say is maybe a little sketchy. Anyway, as I pondered how to kick off this conference, my role as a longtime spectator suggested something. It would not be appropriate for me to attempt any kind of detailed historiographic analysis of this extraordinary scholarly tradition. But I do want to flag, again, out of my experience as a spectator, one rather remarkable trend. Briefly described, it's the gradual infusion over time, the 60 years of my watching, the infusion of moral passion into the scholarship, then versus now. That's the comparison I would like to make. Take Stamp's book as a starting point, as an example of then. It's first rate in all the ways in which we usually measure scholarship: careful research, thoughtful interpretation, sound organization, fluent prose. Moreover, the point of view is pretty clear. For sure, his sympathies go against the peculiar institution. But that choice of title is itself worth pondering. It was a period term used all over the slaveholding states in the antebellum era, and carrying the connotation, slavery is different here from the way it is in other parts of the world. And of course, it's different from anything they have up north. So it's peculiar, but not bad. No reason to get worked up about it. To be clear, this was a slave owner's idea. Stamp's use of the term for his book title might itself be seen as kind of peculiar. Was it irony or what? I'm honestly not sure. Anyway, I think it fits the book's emotional tone and temperature, which is a kind of distanced and dispassionate disapproval of the subject. Not out front opposition, certainly not outrage, but rather disapproval. Over the years that followed, there were ups and downs in the emotional temperature. I won't even try to plot these individually, but the trend line long term was toward a strengthening or heightening of a moral perspective. The emotional temperature was going up. The work of David Davis might give us a singular example. The first in his classic series of studies of slavery, written in the 1960s and called The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, was basically intellectual history, a far-reaching analysis of the ideas that supported and sustained slavery. What were they thinking? Not so much what were they doing. And the they in question was primarily the slave owners, not the slaves themselves. There was a moral undercurrent, to be sure, but not as a primary feature. Contrast this with Davis's final book on the subject, The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Emancipation. It was published just a few years ago, not long before his death, and was full of moral passion, full of the slave's point of view, full of the evil, the moral and human abomination that enslavement truly was. And right there, in another artifact of language, is a further tip-off to the same line of change, from slavery to enslavement as the preferred term. When we say slavery, we seem to mean a fixed condition, something that just was. When we say enslavement, we call attention to the activity of those who made it happen. All this came clear to me in a moment, almost the twinkling of an eye, when several years ago I was reading a book by Edward Baptist, another foremost scholar of this subject, titled The Half Has Never Been Told. Baptist discusses at length the prevalent use of whipping to control the lives and behavior of slaves, and the word he regularly uses for it is torture. The word I had been used to seeing in the much earlier scholarship was discipline, whipping as discipline. I was at least initially shocked. Torture? Really? Like the use of the rack in the Spanish Inquisition or waterboarding in the recent War on Terror? Of course it was torture. Let's call it by its right name. I don't know whether Baptist was the first to use the word torture for this piece of the history of enslavement, perhaps not. Anyway, that's where it first hit me. And obviously it makes a huge difference. I'm going to stop right here. At best, this is window dressing, getting ready for the main event. So I think it's back to you, Bethany. I'm not quite sure, but I'm done.
Thank you so much for such deep and thoughtful window dressing. We all really appreciate it. It is also my pleasure to introduce Edward Carson, who is today's moderator. He is a 20th century he teaches, pardon me, he is a scholar of the American history of race and religion and the Dean of Multicultural Education at the Governor's Academy. Carson's current research looks at race, religion, and Black thought, particularly that of W.E.B. Du Bois. His working manuscript is W.E.B. Du Bois's editorial influence on African American life. He has published and presented papers in peer-reviewed journals and conferences on Black identity, religion, Du Bois, and the nature of history teaching. He published Historical Thinking Skills and has a book chapter on W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm sensing a theme here, Eddie. As a Communist, soon to be published. Joined by historians Philip Lake Siniter and Gerald Horn, they recently published Socialism and Democracy in the Life, Thought, and Legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. UMass guy. Woo! Edward will be this year's speaker for the William Lloyd Garrison Lecture in December 2021. Please join me in welcoming my friend Eddie Carson.
Appreciate that soulful gratitude there and everything. Folks, I'm excited to have everyone here this morning. A lot of stuff that's going to transpire, as John just noted here. Few things real fast as we move throughout the day. What I'll ask you to do is if you have questions for our speakers, raise your hand. Feel free maybe to just remove your mask or to enunciate where we can hear you, and I'll repeat the question. If you are virtual, make sure you submit your question through Q&A, and we will make sure that your question is asked to the entire audience too. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, folks. So our first speaker here, I want to go ahead and introduce to y'all Manisha Sinha. And Manisha is going to come up and Professor Sinha is going to come up and talk about the Abolitionists of International. And it's quite interesting when we talk about the timeliness of her research and of her particular talk here today as we think about the plight of women and how that plight's been under attack, the realities of Black and brown folks here in the 21st century, and of course, these movements in, today as it relates to protests and the announcements of what seems like the suppression of folks who are on the margins, particularly queer folks, Black, brown, Indigenous folks along the way. Sinha explores how Garrisonian abolitionists built transnational networks of protest by aligning anti-slavery and pacifism, women's rights, and utopian socialism. Abolition overlapped with contemporary radical social movements, including the struggle for the rights of labor. Her talk will address both the convergences as well as conflicts between these movements. And again, so many parallels as we wrestle with these struggles here in the 21st century. Folks, let me give you my friend, Professor Manisha Sinha. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Edward, for that generous introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. I have to thank the Governor's Academy, especially Bill Quigley, for getting us here together, and the Museum of Old Newbury, which I had an opportunity to visit yesterday. I would also like to thank John Demos for his introduction. I had a long, long relationship with Professor David Bryan Davis, and in fact, thank you, I needed technical assistance here. Actually, this talk that I'm giving today is a little bit in conversation with David Bryan Davis's thesis on abolition from his second book, which Professor Demos did not mention, and that is The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution. Sorry?
I'm looking for your slide.
Oh, it's supposed to be right here, they said. And I have a dongle here for you to, here you go. All right, so forgive us while we keep setting up. And I just thought it would enliven proceedings if I had a PowerPoint that went along with my lecture. Would be perhaps a little less boring. So, you know, as was mentioned earlier, in my book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, I look at the abolition movement. I'm wondering if we're up there. From the Revolutionary era to the Civil War. So it's a huge time period, and the themes that I look at, is it up? Yes, it is. Well, I can't see it on my computer, which is interesting, but I can see it on the screen, so that should be good. So the book that I wrote, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, as I mentioned, looked at various themes within the abolition movement. I looked at the ways in which we can understand abolition as a radical interracial social movement that included ordinary men and women, black and white. And I centered slave resistance, fugitive slaves, slave rebellions within the movement. I argued that you really do need to look at African Americans to understand the truly radical nature of the movement. And it is something that Garrison himself highlighted and that somehow subsequent historians had missed. I did most of my research on Garrisonian abolition, but other wings of the movement too, and I looked at the ways in which the women's rights movement emerged out of abolition. And I have a whole section on abolitionist feminism. I think some of these women were so remarkable. And again, they're relatively forgotten figures today. But I'm not going to be talking about that. Today, I'll be talking about the Abolitionist International and looking at the transnational radicalism of abolition, especially Garrisonian abolition. Garrison was instrumental in building these transnational networks of protest, and I was just thrilled to stay at the Garrison Inn last night. I just didn't want to leave. The owner, whose card I have and whom I will contact shortly, has done such a wonderful job of recovering artifacts from Garrison. I saw the death mask, of course, at the museum, but the inn itself just does a fabulous job of Garrisonian memorabilia. So those of you who are local here probably know this, but for me, it felt like a bit of a pilgrimage. So as I said earlier, my book is a comprehensive history of abolition, which reevaluates it as a radical interracial social movement. Basically, I argue that far from narrowing the boundaries of freedom as merely self-ownership and legitimizing new forms of inequality, abolition broadened the horizons of democracy and gave birth to other radical passions. The alternative nature of abolition is showcased by the diverse nature of its membership. The movement in which the enslaved and the disfranchised, including women, played a seminal role, was driven by passionate outsiders. Its steady radicalization on women's rights, politics, organized religion, and direct action made it quickly outgrow the empire of religious benevolence and moral reform. And those of you who probably studied abolition in high school probably studied it in those terms. Never the so-called, quote, monomaniacs they were lampooned as, abolitionists starting with the Quakers in the colonial era recognized that the oppression of slaves was linked to other wrongs in their world. So Quaker abolitionism was a reaction to the commercialization of the faith rather than an expression of it, something that Davis had argued. In 1693, Quakers disowned George Keith, the main author of an anti-slavery pamphlet castigating the Friends for their involvement in the slave trade and slavery. So for those of you who say they were men of their times, this was 1693. Keithians condemned the New World practice of buying, quote, the bodies of men for money. The riches of the, quote, merchants of the earth were based on the cruel oppression of blacks and tawnies, who he contended were as much as part of humankind as, quote, white men. Early Quaker abolitionists emerged from that class of colonial society that could identify with the miseries of slaves. For example, John Hepburn, a tailor from New Jersey, who had immigrated to America as an indentured servant in 1684, condemned, quote, this enriching sin in making slaves of men. The hunchback vegetarian Quaker dwarf, Benjamin Lay, pictured here on the left, begged forgiveness at the end of his abolitionist book because, quote, it was written by one that was a poor common sailor and an illiterate man. Like the white servants and Indians who slept, worked, and ran away with Africans in the colonial period, as well as the sailors, pirates, outlaws, and lower classes who conspired and socialized with the enslaved, these men, though more sober and religiously inclined, felt a certain sense of kinship with black people. Quaker abolitionists subsumed their opposition to slavery under a broader critique of warfare, wealth-making, and commerce. Hepburn ridiculed slave owners and merchants as, quote, fine powdered periwigs and great bunched coats, with wives who paint their faces and puff and powder their hair, growing fat on the cruelties inflicted on slaves. Lay renounced all worldly materials, especially those made by slave labor, and thought no good would ever come from the pursuit of, quote, riches. Hepburn, too, argued, quote, riches gotten by wronging the laborer is cursed. Quaker abolitionists urged boycotts of goods made through the exploitation of slaves. Lay smashed his wife's teacups to condemn the consumption of sugar, the first cash crop produced by large numbers of slaves in the Caribbean. Far from justifying free trade and the advent of a market society based on free labor, they asserted that putting money before men contradicted their religious beliefs. Their opposition to slavery was part of a larger criticism that they unleashed on the wealthy and powerful. If Quakerism perfected values well suited to the growth of a capitalist moralité, as David Bryan Davis, following Max Weber's classic, The Spirit of Capitalism and the Protestant Ethic argued, it also engendered early capitalism's most effective critics. Now, 2 years before the slave Jemmy led a revolt replete with Congolese Catholic rituals and military tactics on the banks of the River Stono in South Carolina, Benjamin Lay published his 271-page Philippic, All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage Apostates, in 1737. Sickened by the brutalities of the African slave trade and slavery he had witnessed in Barbados, Lay kidnapped the son of a Quaker slaveholder to acquaint him with the grief of Africans who were torn apart from their families. So he was pretty radical. He disrupted a Quaker meeting by splattering the Bible with pokeberry juice, representing the blood of slaves. Calling slavery a vile and hellish practice, he charged that those who consumed sugar, molasses, and rum, as in New England, all the rum was being made from sugar brought from the Caribbean, that these people literally consumed the blood and flesh of slaves. Images of slaves mangled by punishment, bent from work, starving, and naked dotted his book. Once he stood barefoot in the snow to draw attention to the frostbitten toes and fingers of ill-clad slaves. Lay rejected plans to free slaves only after they had reached majority. This was, of course, the common way in which slavery was abolished in the northern states after the American Revolution through gradual emancipation laws, though not in Massachusetts. The history of that is, of course, rather interesting, too. It's in my book. So gradual emancipation, Lay said, quote, will not salve the sore. It is too deep and rotten. Quoting the scriptures as if to justify slave rebellion, which is remarkable for a Quaker, he wrote, quote, it's better to die by the sword than by famine. As a God-fearing Quaker, Lay said that he would say no more. But, quote, the notorious lies that slaves are content will never go down well. And it's important to note that all these ideas that early Quaker abolitionists, who were rather remarkable, are articulating are coming or being inspired by instances of slave resistance that they witness. And they make that quite clear in their writings, too. Now, if Lay's dramatic and uncompromising testimony against slavery alienated many Quakers, especially slaveholding Quakers, John Woolman, pictured there on your left, made abolitionism respectable. He also, I think, is the first to really come up with this notion of a transnational radical movement. Self-love, or, quote, self-interest, rather than devotion to the common good, Woolman too reasoned was the cause of slavery. Like early Quaker abolitionists, he chastised people for their pursuit of luxuries and wealth, developing a critique of market society, and Whitley pioneered the anti-slavery tactic of encouraging the non-consumption of goods produced by slave labor. But his most remarkable writing, in his, quote, A Plea for the Poor, published long after his death in 1793, Woolman married his anti-slavery concerns to issues like the deteriorating conditions of the working classes and the destruction of the environment by early industrialization. Wealth, as he put it in his opening sentence, was the destroyer of virtue. He drew attention to the plight of the working poor and the exploitative nature of British imperialism and industrial capitalism, because this is just when industrial capitalism takes off in Britain between 1750 to 1850. Another version of his text, quote, A Word of Remembrance and Caution to the Rich, has been dated to 1763. Now, like most Quakers, Woolman was a thoroughgoing reformer who combined anti-slavery testimony with concern for Native Americans, animal abuse, violence and war, and conspicuous consumption. He died in 1772 in England, before the revolutionary abolition movement came of age, but his successor in the role of the preeminent Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet became its founding father, and Benezet is pictured there in the school that he ran for black school children in Philadelphia. He was a French Huguenot descent, but also a Quaker, and he was instrumental in the rise of the revolutionary abolition movement, the Anglo-American movement against the slave trade and slavery. And many of these early abolition and manumission societies that were formed mainly in the North were in fact led by Quakers. Now, abolitionists of what I call the neglected middle period that connect the two waves of anti-slavery, revolutionary and antebellum before the Civil War, were also men of humble means and critics of slavery, luxury, wealth, and warfare. Now, in Philadelphia, many of these Quaker abolitionists worked closely with black abolitionist ministers, former slaves themselves, who had bought their own freedom, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And like Allen and Jones, they justified the slaves' right to free themselves, whether through purchase or running away or even through rebellion. And Allen and Jones, I should mention, founded the historic African-American Methodist Episcopal Church, the one that was attacked in this massacre that occurred in Charleston in 2015. That was a historic church founded by black abolitionists. Now, similarly, Elias Hicks, pictured there on the left, whose teaching precipitated a schism in the Society of Friends, condemned wealth-making. Like Woolman, he traveled extensively and left a journal of his ministry. In 1811, Hicks published his observations on the slavery of African and their descendants, in which he noted that slavery itself was an act of war against the enslaved, upheld by violence and, quote, an avaricious thirst of gain. So these abolitionists are saying the kinds of things that historians of slavery today are talking about. You want to read about torture, you can even read the early abolitionists. Enslaving a person and then taking away all the products of his or her labor, he argued, was robbery. Calling for the immediate abolition of slavery by law, Hicks felt that gradual emancipation, which he said was, quote, the best step yet taken in the northern states, was not fully consistent with what he called, quote, justice and equity. He pointed out that while whites attained adulthood early, black people in the North were forced to labor for their masters for a longer time before they were freed. At the very least, slaveholders ought to educate slave children. And Hicks held consumers and purchasers of slave goods just as culpable in upholding slavery. So he's speaking to northern audiences too. Like Lay, he called on people to abstain from using products produced by slave labor in order to curb, quote, the luxury and excess, the gain of oppression of slaveholders. In 1838, the Quaker-dominated American Free Produce Association also pinpointed, quote, the love of money as the root of the evil of slavery and products of slave labor as, quote, stolen goods. So these were immediatists before the rise of Garrisonian immediatism. Now, another transitional figure and Quaker abolitionist in this history is Benjamin Lundy, who was also of humble origins, a saddle maker by profession. Born in New Jersey, he was converted to abolition when he witnessed the sale of slaves in Wheeling, West Virginia, an important depot in the flourishing domestic slave trade and what historians have called the second slavery, fueled by the cotton boom in the United States. Embarking on a lecture tour of the North in 1828, Lundy inspired future leaders of immediatism, including James and Lucretia Mott in Philadelphia, Arthur Tappan, an evangelical merchant in New York who bankrolled the abolition movement. And for those of you who are confused, abolitionist evangelicalism was a whole different kettle of fish than evangelicals today. Again, clarified in my book. William Goodell, a reform-minded editor in Providence, Rhode Island, Reverend Simeon Jocelyn of New Haven, who ministered to a black congregation, the Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier, and the young journalist William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. In Baltimore, Lundy worked closely and shared living quarters with early black abolitionists like William Watkins and Jacob Greener. In a way, Garrison served an apprenticeship with Lundy. He co-edited his newspaper, The Genius of Universal Emancipation, before beginning his own newspaper, The Liberator. So Garrison served this kind of apprenticeship with Lundy, but he also did that with black ministers and community leaders whom he lived and worked with in Baltimore. Lundy also experimented with radical reform, aiding the free-thinking Frances Wright in her goal of marrying abolition and with feminism, communitarianism, and working men's movements. Wright, one of the first women in abolition to speak publicly, was influenced by Robert Owen, who was known for his model textile factory in New Lanark, Scotland, and the communitarian settlement New Harmony in Indiana, not India. Her compatriot, Robert Dale Owen, pictured here too, attributed his beliefs to his father, who stood up to, quote, the British cotton lords, who were exploiting child labor in Britain and, of course, getting their raw cotton from slave labor in the United States. And his abolitionism to a memorable meeting with the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, who led the movement against the African slave trade in the 1780s and 1790s. Now, Dale Owen and Wright founded an interracial commune modeled after New Harmony in Neshoba, Tennessee in 1825 to prepare slaves for freedom. Joined by British abolitionist and communitarian George Flower, their experiment in interracialism, cooperative labor, and abolition failed amid charges of sexual impropriety and founded as well on a lack of resources. And I should mention, of course, that they were in a slave state, Tennessee, which was a very difficult venture to get off the ground. Dale Owen pronounced it a pecuniary failure, and Wright came under fire for her unconventional views on marriage, sex, labor, and property. Most controversial was her advocacy of interracial unions based on mutual respect and affection, which would create a new race to, quote, undermine the slavery of color existing in the North American Republic. You can imagine how inflammatory that was. Eventually, Wright emancipated the 30-odd enslaved people in Neshoba and accompanied them to Haiti. Now, most early abolitionists, like Lundy, and including Garrison, actually, were strong supporters of the Haitian Revolution and Haitian immigration, but opponents of the American Colonization Society, founded in 1817. The American Colonization Society was a plan to literally send all free African Americans back to Africa and therefore have a slaveholding republic in which all black people would be enslaved and all whites free. It was something that was opposed most staunchly by African Americans themselves. And abolitionists like Garrison and Lundy followed that. But they always valorized Haiti and the Haitian Revolution as an abolitionist revolution, and therefore many times advocated immigration to Haiti. And many abolitionists, black and white, would continue advocating immigration to Haiti right up to the Civil War. And just on the eve of the Civil War, very uncharacteristically, Frederick Douglass briefly thought of migrating to Haiti before the war started and became a war against slavery, and of course, he changed his mind. Now, Wright and Dale Owen also edited the radical free-thinking newspapers, the New Harmony Gazette, and later the Free Inquirer in New York, where they became proponents of educational reform, birth control, and working men's rights, along with the land reformer George Henry Evans and Thomas Skidmore. Skidmore, an early labor leader, not only advocated the equal distribution of property, but also women's rights and abolition. So abolitionists like Lundy flirted with these radical critics of an emerging free society. And Lundy, of course, was also a pivotal figure in the American Convention of Abolition Societies, which was the parent organization of all the state abolition societies, like the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which Benjamin Franklin died as president of that society, the New York Manumission Society, which had Alexander Hamilton and John Jay lend the sort of prestige of their name to those societies. But it is really the radical Quaker abolitionists who are leading these societies. Lundy corresponded with Owen and Wright, published her accounts of Neshoba, and defended her against conservative critics. He complained of, quote, the want of gallantry displayed by American editors towards Wright, who coined the term Fanny Wrightism to dismiss her unconventional and Jacobin views of working men's and women's rights. Lundy praised Neshoba's, quote, most especial object, the protection and regeneration of the race of color, universally oppressed and despised in a country self-denominated free, even though he did not agree with all of Wright's views on marriage and religion. Dale Owen went on to become a Democratic congressman from Indiana. In his public letters to Lincoln during the Civil War, he urged emancipation. He eventually became a radical Republican and an advocate of black citizenship. Again, please don't be confused about partisan affiliations. Everything we know about the two parties today, you really need to just simply flip it for the 19th century. Transnational radicalism intersected with abolitionism, a pattern that was enforced especially with the rise of Garrisonian abolition. Now, more than a few abolitionists, especially Garrison himself, joined such international radical movements as utopian socialism, feminism, and pacifism, and championed Native American immigrant and working men's rights. Some even anticipated, Garrison in particular, contemporary American scourges, criticizing the criminalization of blackness and the use of capital punishment and force by the state. In prioritizing the abolition of slavery, they did not ignore and certainly did not legitimize other forms of oppression in the modern world, which was the common way to understand abolition in academia for a long time. Our country is the world, our countrymen are mankind, was the motto that adorned the Liberator's masthead from 1831 to 1865. As Garrison's adoption of Thomas Paine's slogan indicated, abolitionists, especially Garrisonians, developed a transnational appeal seeking to harness progressive international forces against slavery. So again, far from reinforcing ideas about free society, the nation state, or empire, abolition, in its Garrisonian form particularly, bolstered radical internationalism. Now, contrary to conventional historical wisdom, abolitionists developed an incipient critique of unfettered market society, and linked that with the emancipation of slaves and of all laboring people. And this was especially informed by their long struggle for racial equality. They were not just against slavery, the immediate abolition of slavery, but also for black citizenship in the American Republic, the reason why they rejected the colonization society. They developed a critique of European imperialism in response to their critique of colonization. In its early years, the abolition movement garnered more sympathy from the working classes than from the better sort, many of whom, quote, gentlemen of property and standing, led the anti-abolitionist mobs in the North, pretty much the way Garrison called out Francis Todd for his slaving activities in Newburyport. And I was just so happy to see a statue of Garrison in front of the church from where he was barred from speaking because he did that. Now, the early labor and abolition movements shared a discourse of oppression. Working class reformers adopted the term wage slavery to describe the abysmal conditions of workers, as slavery remained the benchmark of oppression. Less known is the fact that abolitionists sympathized with the plight of labor. As the president of the New York Anti-Slavery Society, William Jay, the son of John Jay, contrasted the voluntary nature of free labor to that of slave labor. But he denounced the criminal prosecution of labor unions, comparing it to the widespread toleration of anti-abolition violence in the North. He noted, quote, journeyman mechanics are indicted and punished for violations of law utterly insignificant in their character and tendency compared to the outrages committed last year. This was, of course, a time when Garrison is led down the streets of Boston by a pro-slavery mob with a noose around his neck. In critiquing slavery, abolitionists did not legitimize wage labor. However, much historians have speculated on the theoretical implications of their arguments. Rather, they drew a connection between the oppression of slaves and that of the wage worker. Garrison, whose critique of free society has been vastly underestimated, supported the 10-hour-a-day movement and cited, quote, the exorbitant exaction of labor and time, the neglect of children's education, the, quote, severe regulations of the factory system, and how rich capitalists grind the face of the poor. These are his words. His prescient critique of financial capitalism is worth quoting at length, because when I was in Britain on a lecture tour for my book in 2016, and I would quote Garrison, and people thought I was quoting Bernie Sanders. And I said, no, this is William Lloyd Garrison in the 1840s. And he wrote, quote, I am writing in Wall Street, where the money changers congregate and where affluence and beggary are seen side by side. It is rightly named Wall Street, for those who habitually occupy it in quest of riches at the expense of mankind are walled in from the sympathies of human nature, and their hearts are as fleshless and hard as the paving stones on which they tread, or the granite and marble buildings which they have erected and dedicated to their idle gain. Only Garrison could write like that. Now, during his third visit to England in 1846, Garrison gave organizational form to the Abolitionist alliance with the British working class Chartist movement. Garrison, Henry C. Wright, Frederick Douglass, George Thompson, and William Lovett and Henry Vincent, the latter two are not pictured here, of the London Workingmen's Association founded the Anti-Slavery League in Britain. Vincent identified the cause of labor with that of abolition, and Garrison commended Lovett and Vincent, quote, for pleading the cause of starving operatives. Garrison wrote, quote, such men I honor and revere. Now, British Garrisonians of the Glasgow Emancipation Society in Scotland and Irish abolitionists bolstered Garrison's attempt to establish transnational networks of radical protests. They became regular contributors to the Liberator, drawing telling parallels between oppressed English workers, starving Irish peasants, and slaves. Garrison tried to replicate this alliance at home. The incorporation of most of the urban immigrant working class into the Southern-leaning, pro-slavery at that time, Democratic Party, which was staunchly anti-abolitionist, alienated them from the abolition movement and instigated mob violence against blacks and abolitionists by white immigrants. While immigrants' hostility to abolition was the result of a process of Americanization through which they sought to accrue the benefits of, quote, whiteness and hyper-nationalism to demonstrate loyalty to their adopted country, abolitionists deplored nativism in principle and appealed to immigrants to join their cause. Now, Garrison criticized British rule in Ireland as the root of all its sufferings, including the great famines that had led to the migrations to the United States. In the 1840s, he made a concerted effort to court the Irish by favoring the repeal of the British Union with Ireland. He elicited the services of Irish abolitionists and the great Irish nationalist Daniel O'Connell, who had befriended him during his visit to England. On his return to the United States in 1841, black abolitionist Charles Remond, and of course Remond was the first black lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society long before Douglass, Remond brought with him, quote, an address from the people of Ireland to their countrymen and countrywomen in America, composed by Irish abolitionists and signed by O'Connell and 60,000 others, urging Irish immigrants to, quote, unite with the abolitionists. Abolitionists publicized the Irish appeal in mass meetings in Boston and Philadelphia, New York, but Irish American leaders, especially those associated with the Democratic Party and the Catholic Church, such as Bishop John Hughes, challenged its veracity and condemned it, ironically, as, quote, foreign interference. Irish American repealers tried to distance O'Connell from abolitionists, but in the end, O'Connell refused to renounce abolition, as he famously wrote to Irish Americans, quote, it was not in Ireland that you learned this cruelty. Now, like the Garrisonians, political abolitionists associated with the Liberty Party, William Goodell, Eliza Wright, and Gerrit Smith, sought to address the systemic inequalities of free society besides attacking slavery. In 1844, George Henry Evans' National Reform Association brought together utopians, former Chartists, and labor activists with the slogan, vote yourself a farm. He built on a radical tradition going back to Paine's agrarian justice and Skidmore's The Rights of Man to Property. Now, Smith, a land magnate, was a convert to Evans' crusade against land monopoly and pronounced himself an agrarian. In 1846, Smith deeded thousands of acres, not just to black people, but also to the landless and poor men and women. This is where, of course, John Brown also got a deed of land and lived amongst African Americans much before Harper's Ferry's raid, and of course his grave is still there in upstate New York. Now, most of the Smith grantees sold their lands for a payment of taxes, but his experiment in land redistribution was unique. And it would be remembered again during Reconstruction, and I'm writing a book on Reconstruction right now, when the question came up whether freed people should be given land that they had worked on for generations without receiving any of the fruits of their labor. Now, in 1848, Evans Industrial Congress nominated Smith a Liberty Party man. Liberty Party was a political abolitionist party, a precursor to the anti-slavery Free Soil and then Republican Party. They nominated him for the presidency, even though Smith declined the honor. Elected to Congress in 1850 on the Liberty ticket, Smith championed the distributing of public lands to the landless. Now, even the evangelical abolitionists like Lewis Tappan, who differed from Garrison, there was a schism between these two wings of the abolition movement in 1840 over various issues, over politics, over women's rights, and religion. So even somebody like Tappan, who was relatively conservative compared to Garrison, admonished the British, quote, that the rich would be better off if half or two-thirds of their wealth were distributed among their poor fellow men. He recommended, quote, subdivisions of landed property and cultivation of small farms to achieve more, quote, equality in property. Now, rejecting electoral politics, Garrisonians were more interested in utopian communities, most founded in the wake of the Panic of 1837, which was one of those cyclical capitalist panics and depressions that plagued the Western world right up to the Great Depression. So he was more interested in these communities founded in the wake of the Panic of 1837 and inspired by early socialist thinkers like Owen, Charles Fourier, and Claude-Henri Saint-Simon. Garrison's conservative critics accused him of harboring, quote, radical no government as well as no property theories. No government because he criticized the use of force by the state. In an editorial on socialist organizations, sympathetically evoking Owen and Fourier, Garrison commended the idea of cooperative communities, personified in the abolitionist Northampton Association for Education and Industry, led by his brother-in-law, George Benson. And this was one of the few utopian communities of the time that had African-American members, like the famous abolitionists Sojourner Truth and David Ruggles, who spent his last days practicing hydropathy or water cure in this community. Ruggles was known for his fight to protect the rights of fugitive slaves in New York City. Now, Garrison also lauded his fellow non-resistant Aidan Ballew's Hopedale community, also in Massachusetts, which was founded in 1842, and the Transcendentalist community at George Ripley's Brook Farm, which also adopted Fourierism. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society agent, John Collins, journaled The Communitist, which advocated communal ownership of property. So all these ideas are circulating within the abolition movement. In the 1850s, abolitionists began raising the cause of labor in anti-slavery meetings with increasing frequency. At the New England Anti-Slavery Convention, William Henry Channing, a self-proclaimed, quote, socialist abolitionist, argued, logically, I have never been able to separate the anti-slavery movement from all those directed to raise labor universally. Stephen Foster and Parker Pillsbury, the New Hampshire duo who were abolitionist Nathaniel Rogers' protégés and heirs to his ideological radicalism, supported Channing's call for interlinking the two movements. Now, Garrison was one of the friendly editors who supported the journeyman's printer strike against wage reductions in Boston during this time. And if you look over the minutes of the New England Anti-Slavery Convention, you can see all these people appear. Excuse me, African Americans, women's rights activists, labor activists, and their speeches are actually worth reading for all those who think that these ideas are somehow un-American. The sectional crisis over slavery did not divert either the communitarian or labor movement from their goals. There was considerable cross-fertilization of ideas and organizing between abolition and them. Garrisonian support for communitarian principles and Chartism, and political abolitionists and free soilers championing of the cause of labor and land reform, sometimes at the cost of indigenous people, land reform, should lead to a re-evaluation of the perception that abolitionists were moralistic individualists, blind to the sufferings of the working poor nearer home. Now, the European revolutions of 1848 for representative government and national liberation also helped to internationalize abolition. Abolitionists viewed the revolutions of 1848, which produced radical, democratic, socialist, and feminist ideas, as kindred movements. The anti-slavery actions and words of European revolutionaries like Giuseppe Mazzini won high praise from abolitionists, and in fact, Mazzini corresponded with Garrison. When the Second Republic in France abolished slavery in 1848, mainly on Victor Schellcher's instigation, there he is in the middle, Garrison convened a special meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society at Faneuil Hall to congratulate the French Republic, which was attended by Garrisonians, Liberty Party abolitionists, radical anti-slavery politicians like Charles Sumner, one of the founding members of the Republican Party in the 1850s. Abolitionists identified the despotic slave power of the United States with European forces of reaction and monarchy, and their own battle against slavery with the European revolutionary struggles. Most American conservatives and slaveholders typically balked at, quote, the red republicanism of the 1848 revolutions. For abolitionists, feminists, and other assorted radicals, the overthrow of the French Republic and Mazzini's Roman Republic threw into sharp contrast the 19th century vogue of narrow nationalism versus universal human values and rights that they advocated for disfranchised sections of the nation. Long before the United Nations Declaration, abolitionists were publishing journals called Human Rights and systematically evoking human rights to address the rights of Black people and for the Garrisonians, including women. When the Hungarian patriot Lajos Kossuth toured the United States in 1851-52 in search of arms and financial support, Garrison and Frederick Douglass, who had now broken on the issue of politics, both criticized his silence on slavery. According to Henry C. Wright, Kossuth had sacrificed humanity at the altar of narrow nationalism. Now, the immigration of German 48ers after the collapse of the Frankfurt Parliament had an impact on the politics of abolition. Some of these free-thinking German immigrants joined existing radical movements, the labor movement, land reform, women's rights, and abolition. The 48ers formed alliances with abolitionists and brought a substantial section of the German immigrant population into the then anti-slavery Republican Party. One of them, Karl Heinzen, published The German Pioneer in Boston. He asked Garrison to condemn an impending nativist amendment in Massachusetts that would make immigrants wait for 2 years before voting, scaled down considerably from the initial 21 years and 14 years bans. But barring, he noted, men like Mazzini and the anti-slavery German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, whom abolitionists admired from the polls. Assuring Garrison of German support for abolition, he asked, quote, the noble advocate of Black rights to say a word on behalf of the rights of the immigrated. Garrison, who had written an early editorial denouncing nativism in 1844, obliged. He characterized the amendment as, quote, the last expiring efforts of nativism. Little did he know. Despite being enamored of the tactics and success of British abolition, American abolitionists, especially Garrisonians, were staunch critics of British imperialism. They had done that in the case of Ireland, and they continue to do that. And this is something that struck out for me because I grew up in India, and reading these pages of The Liberator, I can happily say I've read every issue from 1831 to 1865, I found all these articles on British India, which really caught my attention. Now, in 1839, British Quaker abolitionist Joseph Pease, the father of Elizabeth Pease, founded the British India Society to criticize British imperialism. Garrison, in fact, named one of his daughters after Elizabeth Pease. She died in infancy. Its original purpose, this is the British India Society, was to combat slavery in India, but it soon became a critic of, quote, the accumulated wrongs inflicted on the Indian people by British rule. British Garrisonians like William Adam and George Thompson, both of whom had stayed in India, joined the British India Society, which included Indian nationalists. British abolitionists elected Dwarkanath Tagore, the father of the Nobel Prize-winning nationalist author Rabindranath Tagore, as an honorary member of the Glasgow Emancipation Society. Alfred Webb, pictured here, was the son of the Irish abolitionist Richard Webb, a Garrisonian, and he was elected as vice president to a convention of the Indian National Congress. Now, I wouldn't have known any of this if I had not read The Liberator. Now, the sort of personal relationships between abolitionists and early Indian nationalists bore testimony to the anti-imperialism of the movement. And I discovered this by looking at a grave of a very famous Indian nationalist and social reformer. He died while being ministered to by abolitionists in England. And his grave today is in Bristol, England. I did not know that. Having studied this man growing up in India, but I found this in the pages of The Liberator. Now, British abolitionists like John Estlin, who provided medical care to Roy, sent locks of his hair to sell at the Boston Anti-Slavery Bazaar, just as British abolitionists had earlier sent Americans locks of hairs of William Wilberforce, the famous abolitionist parliamentarian. That surprised me too. In England, Garrison and Riemann gave speeches before the British India Society and linked the cause of the American slave with the oppressed millions of India. On Thompson's second tour of the United States, Garrison introduced him as one who had exposed British injustice and tyranny in India, as well as the horrors of slavery. When the Indian Revolt broke out in 1857, which started out as a mutiny of soldiers and became a mass uprising against British rule, Garrison was horrified at, quote, the calls of vengeance in Britain. To him, it was, quote, a mockery for a people to subjugate nations, rob them, apply physical tortures, and goad them to insurrection. And he compared the British reaction to the Great Revolt to slaveholders' reaction to Nat Turner's rebellion and other slave rebellions. In 1898, William Lloyd Garrison Jr., his son, helped found the Anti-Imperialist League, which adopted his father's famous abolitionist slogan, "Our country is the world, our country mankind." In the United States, abolitionists criticized settler colonialism from the start and drew attention to the plight of Native Americans. I thought it was important to include that today, considering the day we are marking. Lundy, like most early Quaker abolitionists, had denounced the, quote, slaveholding, land jobbing, and Indian exterminating character of the slaveholding republic. Many evangelical abolitionists honed their skills in protest against Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policies. In their opposition to colonization, abolitionists also drew attention to the genocidal nature of the European conquest of the New World. Critiquing the missionary purpose of the American Colonization Society, Eliza Wright pointed to attempts to Christianize Indians that had resulted in the destruction of native cultures. The principle of colonization, Garrison observed, evoking the history of the United States and the British in India, does not lead to, quote, a very warm friendship between colonists and natives. I can see that I am kind of running out of time, but I would end by saying that abolitionists were strong opponents of Indian dispossession. In 1838, David Lee Child, pictured here, denounced the atrocious plot of the United States government to deprive Indians of their lands and expand slavery. Anti-slavery politicians such as Joshua Giddings opposed the Second Seminole War in 1835 as pro-slavery and anti-Indian, citing the resistance of maroon communities of runaway slaves in the Florida swamps. Now, after the Civil War, abolitionists criticized the attempt to use the newly empowered nation to despoil rather than guarantee Native American rights. Many leading abolitionists connected the cause of the former slaves with that of plain Indians. In 1867, Lydia Maria Child published an appeal for the Indians, modeled after her pamphlet of 1833, an appeal on behalf of African Americans. Cora Daniels Tappan said that abolitionists should form a society protesting, quote, exterminating wars against Indians. She was referring to the wars against Native Americans, the Plains Indians especially, at this time. And I will just quickly end by noting that in his speech in 1880 before Congress, Blanche K. Bruce, one of the first black senators from Mississippi during Reconstruction, which of course was overthrown, and you had then this sort of nightmare, racial nightmare of lynching, debt peonage, sharecropping, racist terror, Jim Crow in the South. Now, this one of these first black senators during Reconstruction, he called for a reversal in a speech in Congress of federal policy towards Native Americans. So, quote, as to not exterminate them, but to perpetuate them on this continent. So he's carrying forth the abolitionist vision. Since I seem to have run out of time, I will not be talking about the pacifist movement, unfortunately, but I'll be happy to answer questions when the time comes. I will end by, I think I hit the wrong thing, but I will end by saying that abolition expanded rather than contracted radical horizons. Abolitionists, for the most part, challenged rather than shored up the status quo. From women's rights, which I was not able to talk about, the abolition of capital punishment, the peace movement, which I was also not able to talk about, and immigrant and working men's rights, to the rights of native populations trampled by European settlers and imperialism, abolitionists linked the slaves' cause with a variety of causes. And again, those of you who are interested in this, I would say go to the book. Abolitionist ideas on racial inequality are a starting point in an interracial discourse of democratic radicalism in the United States and the modern world. Their concerns relentlessly internationalist and eclectic. It was the eclipse rather than the triumph of the abolitionist worldview after the fall of Reconstruction that led to the most egregious crimes against humanity at home and abroad. Thank you for listening so patiently.
Thank you. That was exceptional, my friend. I appreciate it a lot. And I have lots of questions, and I suspect we have a number of questions from folks who are participating virtually and those who are here. So feel free, if you would like, to ask Professor Sinha anything from her presentation or anything that you're pondering during this particular time period. Yes, ma'am. Sir, excuse me.
Can you say something about the arc of Lincoln's relationship to the abolitionist movement?
That's a wonderful question. And you know, today I talked about all these radical strains within the abolition movement. And for a long time, historians kind of dismiss abolition as a sort of a sideshow, you know, a movement, a social movement that really didn't have any impact on national politics. And I argue just the opposite. I argue that without the abolitionist movement literally plowing the ground for 30 years prior, the second wave I'm talking about in the 19th century, before the Civil War, you could not imagine the emergence of a free soil party like the Republican Party in the 1850s and the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency of the United States in 1860. The fact that a majority of Northern men voted for, an overwhelming majority, I should say, of Northern men voted for an anti-slavery Republican Party in 1860 really shows you the ground that was laid by abolition. So I have a whole chapter on what I call the politics of abolition, tracing the influence of abolitionists, particularly on radical Republicans like Sumner, like Thaddeus Stevens, like George Julian, like Joshua Giddings, whom I just spoke about. These were the men who were literally at the vanguard of the anti-slavery Republican Party. And were closely tied to the abolition movement. And I think if you want to really understand Lincoln's role, read Garrison on Lincoln. You know, Garrison was against politics. He opposed the political abolitionists and later had a very bad break with Frederick Douglass over mainly tactics and ideology when Douglass decided to go the political route, and Garrison said that the abolition movement should never become a political party. It should remain an agitational movement outside politics, because that's the realm of compromise. And so when Lincoln is elected, one of his biggest cheerleaders is Garrison throughout, and he defends Lincoln right up to the end as really representing the end of the abolition movement, as representing what the abolitionists had fought for. And if you look at Lincoln's own trajectory from non-expansion of slavery and being a colonizationist, throughout the 1850s, Lincoln was a colonizationist, like his beau ideal of a statesman, Henry Clay, and like Jefferson, and like Madison. He moves from that position to abolition and black rights, black citizenship in the American Republic. He becomes the first American president to publicly endorse black male citizenship. And so I think you can really understand the way Garrison eventually looks at Lincoln as a fruit of all his labors. And Lincoln says, when he's praised as the great emancipator, he says, don't praise me, praise the forgotten abolitionists. He says, we all know who Garrison and Wilberforce are. Every schoolboy can tell you their name, but who knows the names of the people who actually opposed these men? So, their relationship was a lot more complicated. I've written a lot about this. It's in my book, and several articles also on the relationship between Lincoln and abolitionists, which I think was misunderstood both from the left and the right.
I have a question. I saw that a hand. Yes, ma'am.
Again, a great question.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Some of our online.
Sure. Absolutely. So the question is that Frederick Douglass used Native Americans as kind of a straw man for black Americans, and so did many other black abolitionists, and what I thought about that. And it's a really good question, because remember, for African Americans, the struggle always was for equal citizenship in this country. Even those who had projects of immigrating outside the United States, that was not an acceptance of second-class citizenship in this country. It was a rejection of it. So they had that goal. For Native Americans, it was never a question of citizenship. It was a question of sovereignty. So especially in this new book that I'm writing on Reconstruction, I'm seeing the ways in which abolitionists had difficulty addressing the Native American plight, even though they were sympathetic to it, because for them it was citizenship, equal citizenship, and the republic was important to create an interracial democracy in this country, or what Douglass famously said, our composite nationality. For Native Americans, it was always a question of dispossession and sovereignty. And they inhabit this kind of no man's land in American law and federal policy, where they neither have the rights of citizenship, nor do they have accorded the privileges of a sovereign nation. So it's a more complicated question, and I tease that out much more in my book on Reconstruction, forthcoming book.
Any other questions from folks here in the audience? Nothing online? Okay, so here's what we're